Alberta's Justice Minister, Casey Medew, has condemned a group of white supremacist protesters who were hanging out at an Edmonton grocery store parking lot. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, is here to chat more about it. Tyler, when the counter-protesters arrived, that's when the fights broke out and police were called in.
That's right. So, as you said, there's this sort of demonstration in, of all places, a grocery store parking lot, sort of towards North Edmonton, and the clashes between the groups. Police were called, sort of descended on the grocery store parking lot, and sorted it out. Now, the justice minister has been under some, let's say, pressure for the last little while, as there have been a handful of sort of similar incidents about this, or like this, I should say. One in Red Deer recently, another one in Ponoka. And again, on Wednesday, he came out quite strongly against it, saying, he respects the right to assemble peacefully, but, there's no place for these. I think he called them sad losers hanging out in a grocery store parking lot. So some strong words from the justice minister. And, it's just another example of, some of the issues that we've been seeing across Canada, across the United States. They're happening here in Alberta too, whether in the big city or small towns.
Yeah, you mentioned that, what happened in central Alberta as well. Let's touch on that a little bit here. The protest involved violence and condemnation from provincial politicians. Some of the BLM protesters were assaulted in Red Deer, and there was that incident of a hit and run in Ponoka as well that may have been racially motivated.
Yeah, the RCMP are investigating the case in Ponoka. I don't believe they've made any arrests yet. That was during a protest a couple weeks ago now. And the other one in Red Deer, yeah, there was, really extensive video footage of these sort of confrontations between Black Lives Matter protesters who were chanting, and then counter protesters telling them to get out of town, get out of Alberta. And, some punches thrown, scuffles, some pretty awful footage actually out of that. And again, Justice Minister had to scramble and condemn it, saying that this is not acceptable in Alberta. So it's been a rambunctious, that's probably understating it. It's been a strange couple weekends around the province.
Do we know, Tyler, if some of these Black Lives Matter protesters were actually brought in, maybe flown in or driven in, or were they local people?
I believe they're mostly local people. My understanding is they're mostly local, but there have been these protests sort of happening around the province. So people might be traveling around the province. Given the pandemic and travel restrictions, I would be very surprised if people were coming, exceptionally long distances. But there was also the sense in some of the reporting around it that there were, because these communities are sort of so close together, you might be at a Ponoka protest one weekend and then in the one in Red Deer the next weekend. So I do imagine there's a little bit of travel, but certainly no, indication of international travel or anything like that.
Well, yeah, because sometimes you get plants, right? People brought in specifically to stir things up a little bit, stir the pot. Now, the province released its opioid report during the throne speech last week, Tyler. It shows an increase in opioid-related deaths in our province. It also showed an increase in hospitalization, and fewer people were following their treatment programs. Now, since the UCP yanked funding on the supervised consumption site at Arches here in Lethbridge, government officials say more programs are underway to help people not only in our city, but across the province.
Yeah, that's right. So the interesting thing about these numbers is they're the second quarter numbers. So they ran sort of April, May, June, I believe is what it was. And so Arches closed over the summer, which means that which was the busiest supervised consumption site, I believe, in the country, certainly the province. And so this report does not show any sort of effects of that closure, since it was still open when the report was made. What it does show, as you said, pretty significant spike in hospitalizations. You went from about 2,000 hospitalizations in the quarter before that, so January to March, and then some 3,000 and a bit in the next 3 months. And deaths as well, 449 deaths, I believe, is what the report said. We'd been contrasting that with the coronavirus, which has killed about 260 odd people in Alberta. So pretty significant increases in deaths. And I spoke with Jason Luan earlier this week, and he said, look, we've spent lots of money on addiction treatment, on detox beds, on mental health supports. These things are available. And he's really pushing back against the idea that there needs to be more supervised consumption sites. Perhaps there needs to be a safe drug supply provided by the government. Things like that. He's really pushing back against, has been since he became the associate minister. So I guess we'll have to see what the summer brought. When you compound the effects of the pandemic, people losing their jobs, all these other factors, I don't think it's a massive surprise there were some problems on the drug use front.
And Addictions and Mental Health Minister Jason Lewan also commented on the unsanctioned tent, the injection site that was set up here in Lethbridge, saying it's illegal, you got to tear it down. But I tell you, it's a real contentious issue here in our city, because the people with the Lethbridge Overdose Prevention Society is saying that the SCS truck that's set up across from the soup kitchen is not enough and more needs to be done. So they've been fined $300 for setting up that tent where they were not supposed to, but they're still fighting back. So remains to see what's going to happen here in our city. Now, Tyler, Premier Jason Kenney was not impressed with the Liberals' recent throne speech. He called it a full frontal attack on provincial jurisdiction and did not contain anything to help Albertans, especially for our battered energy sector.
Yeah, that's right. So Jason Kenney has been, a little bit quieter, I would say, a little bit less bombastic maybe than he has been for, the earlier part of his tenure as premier. But he was really back in sort of full fighting form last week. As you say, he called it a full frontal attack on provincial jurisdiction. Were many things in there that were provincial jurisdiction, from policing regulations to daycare to pharmacare. These are all sort of things the Liberals have promised before, but are now saying that they're going to implement them faster, spend more money, etc. As the Premier pointed out, there's not a single mention of the word pipeline in the entire 6,700-word document or something like that. Any mention of the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, are sort of in the context of retraining workers, renewable energy, things like that. So what we saw from Kenney was almost a greatest hits reel, to be honest. He was talking about fair deal for Alberta. He was talking about fiscal stabilization and equalization. He was talking about Northern Gateway, Keystone XL, Bill C-49, C-68, all these things that, we've been talking about for a year now, that he's been talking about for a year, for longer, and that have sort of fallen a little bit by the wayside. He was really came out swinging against it, and actually was joined by some of the other premiers as well. Premier Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, not super impressed. Premier Francois Legault of Quebec, saying that there wasn't anything in there about topped up federal healthcare transfer payments. Certainly remains to be seen what a budget might look like, but Kenney was back at it. He was mad. He was condemnatory. Did not strike me as a very impressed man when he was talking about the throne speech last week.
I was chatting with Lethbridge Tory MP Rachel Harder as well, and she was talking about the throne speech, saying that not only was nothing mentioned about Alberta's energy sector, but Alberta farmers as well, so she wasn't too impressed either. Keystone XL, let's go back to talking about pipelines for just a second. Keystone XL builder TC Energy announced a new partnership agreement with an Indigenous group. It's a minority stake in the pipeline, and details will be announced, in the last quarter?
Yes, that's right. So one of those things where there was an announcement, not a whole ton of details on it. As I understand it, there's a handful of Alberta First Nations investors involved, and I believe one from Saskatchewan as well. So this is, the provincial government has sort of put money up backing Keystone XL to get it built. This is the pipeline that runs down to Steel City, Nebraska, I believe, from Hardisty. And so another embattled project been going on forever. But this is one of the first sort of Indigenous partnerships and pipelines that I can think of that come to mind immediately, that have actually sort of been proceeding. There's been a lot of discussion about this. We talked about it with the Trans Mountain expansion last year. Maybe there was going to be an Indigenous purchaser of that. There's the conglomerate looking to build the Eagle Spirit pipeline. So this is, it's an interesting step for TC Energy, for Keystone XL, and we'll just have to bide our time a little bit and see what comes out of it.
It seems it goes a long way towards reconciliation as well when you get the Indigenous groups involved and also cut them in for a little bit of a share. It creates jobs, it creates money as well for a lot of the Indigenous people. So many people would argue it's a really good thing. U.S. President Donald Trump issued a presidential permit to link Edmonton to Alaska via railway. And Tyler, it's not just going to be for oil.
No, that's right. A bit of economic good news this week. How often have we been able to say that recently? So yeah, presidential permit for this rail line. Now, there already is rail sort of obviously in Alaska. There is already rail in Alberta. But this is going to sort of build a corridor that goes from Alaska over through the Yukon, through the Northwest Territories, and down to Edmonton, basically just linking up existing rail lines. I believe it's a $22 billion project. The proponents are saying it should create about 18,000 jobs. And the idea is that it'll take all kinds of commodities. Now, there has been talk over the years of sort of bypassing some of the problems in northern BC and on the BC coast by getting things like oil up to Alaska to ship them out of there. So yes, oil could certainly be one of those commodities, but other things like grains and things like that could be transported as well because you can run a freight train as easily as you can run a tanker car. So we'll have to see what the timeline looks like when that's completed, but it's certainly a bit of good news when otherwise we haven't had a whole lot of that recently.
Tyler, the NDP is demanding an apology from the UCP for MLA Shane Getson's comments that CERB recipients were sitting around watching cartoons and eating cheesies instead of going to work. Around 1.6 million Albertans have taken CERB payments over the course of the pandemic.
Yes, that's right. So the NDP is sort of condemning that, saying that it's rude and condescending. Some older viewers perhaps will remember, I believe it was Paul Martin's chief of staff or press secretary, can't quite remember which, saying people were spending money on beer and popcorn. Um, so similar sort of to that. But yeah, that was the gist of the comment, saying that business owners struggling to find people to come into work because they were making more money on CERB. Anyways, but just a small controversy this week, I suppose, that the NDP has picked up on and is saying is a bit tone deaf and things like that. And as you said, more than 1 million people in Alberta have taken CERB payments as of the last figures on the Government of Canada website. So, that's something like 1 in 4 people. It's a significant number.
Let's talk about the Auditor General's report, which says the province's disaster tracking system is not up to snuff. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the Auditor General looked into sort of our disaster management planning, and what he found was essentially that there's a patchwork of disaster planning and disaster monitoring. So these can be things like floods, these could be things like wildfires. I suppose you could add earthquakes to that mix. Not sure how big a worry earthquakes are around here, but basically the big thing that he pointed out was that what the province doesn't know is having a good assessment of what the biggest risk is. And so you can't really plan well for these disasters if you don't know what they are. So is it a giant wildfire? Is it significant flooding, things like that. So now the government says they should have a plan by early 2021, so not too far off. They're working on it, but this was the big issue that he exposed. Now, the other reason why this sort of matters is that if you look back on the money that's been spent over the past decade or so, you had something like $9 billion in money spent on disaster recovery between like 2009 and 2016, somewhere's about that. And it was only a few hundred million for the sort of set of years before that, 2003 to 9 or something like that. So, huge amounts of money spent on fire rebuilding, flood recovery, Calgary, Fort McMurray, wherever. So certainly the government wants to be on top of that. And by all indications, they are working on it. It's just, auditors' reports tend to come out at inopportune times.
Tyler, we recently had NDP leader Rachel Notley in Lethbridge, along with Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips, holding a town hall. Do the UCP ever look at the NDP, the official opposition, say, why are you guys holding a town hall? We're the ones here in government. We're the ones who should be holding the town hall sessions. Do the NDP just want to kind of gather some facts and information so heading into the next election, these are the issues that you did not deal with when you were in power?
Well, I think the NDP is gaining its footing. There've been a handful of things that have happened over the past sort of 6 months that suggest to me they're gaining their legs. There was polling a week or two ago that we talked about where Rachel Notley and Jason Kenney are sort of neck and neck, and I think it's probably part of the NDP's long-term planning for the next election. I mean, it's obviously a long ways off. But, I think when they won the previous election, a lot of people looked at that as a fluke. A lot of people looked at that as people were tired of, 40 years of PC leadership and what were the alternatives? So the NDP won. I certainly don't get the sense from the NDP from the times that I've spoken with Rachel Notley that they see it as a fluke. They I think are obviously the second largest party. I think they feel that they are in a position to form government again. Certainly Rachel Notley said that recently. The Globe and Mail had a headline saying that she said she would run again, things like that. So, I think it is just sort of long-term planning on their part and building relationships where they think that they have an in, where they think they can pick up another riding or two, Lethbridge obviously being one of those places. So I think that's what's going on with the NDP right now.
Why do you think it is, though, that it really is two parties here in Alberta, the UCP and the NDP, and David Conn and the Liberals are not really making any headway, or even the Alberta Party? Why do you think that is right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. My suspicion would be that in the last election, people looked at their options and thought, maybe I'm an Alberta Party supporter, but I really want the NDP gone, so I'm going to vote UCP. Or maybe people said, I'm kind of a liberal, but the NDP might have a better shot of beating Jason Kenney's UCP. So I think you had a vote split in that, like a tactical vote split for a lot of people in the last election, and that ended up with the minor parties getting no seats, which just really puts them in a pile of trouble. And then the other part of it, of course, is the pandemic happened. So we talked a couple weeks ago about the Alberta Party unable to find a leader just yet, which is a bit of a problem. They would struggle to have press events now because of physical distancing and things like that. The UCP and the NDP are able to access, the call-in systems for journalists to phone into. So I think there's sort of a logistical thing going on. I think there's sort of a hangover from the last election thing going on. Um, and no doubt there's certainly some polarization where people are continuing to stick, I think, with the two major parties because they, dislike their opponents so much they don't want to, risk throwing their vote away with someone who isn't going to win.
Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.